Good evening, my name is Marc Marin, and I will be speaking in behalf of Pedro, Azara, Joan, Borrell, and myself, coming from the Polytechnical University of Catalunya in Barcelona, in Spain. Originally, our subject should have been focused exclusively on the conditions of exhibiting archaeological material, but we will be presenting a surely different case study, as you will see. The three of us collaborated in the conception and organization of an exhibition that took place at the Institute for the Studies of the Ancient World in New York, called From Ancient to Modern Archaeology and Aesthetics, shown from February to June 2015. The show focused, among other crucial subjects, on the reception of Mesopotamian archaeological material, on modern and contemporary artists, mainly American and European, since the 1920s until nowadays. Georges Bataille, Henry Moore, Alberto Giacometti, Willem de Kooning were presented as case studies on how some Sumerian masterpieces, including the headdress of Queen Puabi of Ur, the worshipper statues and figurines found in the Diyala Valley in Iraq, and a selection of well-known archaeological material from Kish, had been interpreted and judged by the 20th century Western audiences and through an eminently modern aesthetic criteria. The narrative of the exhibition was strongly nourished by the recent research of scholars such as Zainab Bahrani and Jean Evans. Nonetheless, if we had known back then the subject that we will be presenting today, possibly the selection of pieces would have followed a different criteria. In August of this year, 2 months after the closing of the exhibition at the ISAW in New York, a holiday visit to the foundation of the Spanish painter and sculptor Joan Miró in Palma de Mallorca in Spain exposed us to a most intriguing revelation. One of the rooms of an old traditional house where he held his studio, known as Son Boter, showed nearly a dozen photograph cuttings showing Mesopotamian, mostly Sumerian masterpieces. These photographs had been hung by Miro himself in the late 1950s and had never been removed ever since. The joint exposure of ancient and modern material suggesting and studying the interesting relations emerging between them was in fact precisely what was intended to achieve at the ISAW exhibition. We were both surprised and disappointed, since we realized that Miro would have been an excellent case study for the Archaeology and Aesthetics show. We had no further knowledge of previous research indicating Miro's inclination towards Sumerian art. Further research brought us to a paper presented by Birgit Pedro on a colloquium in London 5 years ago, on the influence of Mesopotamian art in modern art and architecture. In her paper, Pedro had noticed the presence of these images in Miro's studio, among other examples. However, since her paper did not mention the origin of these images, we have since started our own research on the matter, as a sort of an addendum case study research for the ISAW exhibition. For our research, we have been generously helped by the curators and librarians at the Miro Foundations and Succession in Barcelona and in Palma de Mallorca in Spain, as well as Miro's heirs. To the day of today, we have not yet found one single reference mentioning Miro's inclination towards Mesopotamian art. We find numerous mentions on Miro's look on Greek art, African art, pre-Columbian art, mostly Kachina dolls, Eastern art, meaning China and Japan, or sculptures from the Eastern Island, but nothing on Mesopotamia. To the knowledge of the curators, relatives, and ourselves, no article in a book, catalog, or magazine, with the exception of Pedro's paper, mentioned, for instance, that the mask of Huarca and some of the most famous large Cafage statues had attracted Miro's attention. The walls at the studio in Son Boter, on which Miro hung these photographs, are washed in white plaster, which the painter used to cover with graffiti, showing human figures, mostly traces of female figures and heads. Miro declared to be unable to make art in a space with no qualities. He needed to fill the walls with items and images he loved. He needed to be surrounded by them. These items on the walls were mostly small, cheap, anonymous items, such as toys, shells, stones with certain shapes, small branches, traditional art figurines, industrial items with shapes that could be read as anthropomorphic or animal forms. They had a strong emotional and personal value to him. These elements were used as motifs. He used them as an inspiration for the paintings and sculptures he designed in his studio. The photographs, particularly, were some of the first items he placed at his studio to accommodate the space, after he bought the house in the late 1950s. He never decided to remove them. We know now that the Sumerian figures lasted for 30 years on the walls of his studio, and on his will he clearly specified that everything should be kept as it was at the time of his decease. Almost all pictures show archaeological items, except for a photograph of a traditional chair. We see ancient Balkan bell-shaped idols, a sculpture that seems to be a cypress head showing both Greek and Near Eastern features, an Iranian Amlash or female idol or mother goddess from the first millennium BCE, a bronze scepter from Palestine located at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, an African statue that we still not have been able to localize, 2 Catalan Romanesque frescoes, and finally Sumerian masterpieces, including statues, figurines, masks, and reliefs. Since the early 60s, he dedicated himself to fully covering the walls of his studio with charcoal graffitis. Words and expressions suggesting titles of works of art can be read, written in French and in Catalan. Some of them can easily be related to well-known works of Miró, such as Femme, Femme et Oiseau, Femme et Coquillage, Personnage dans la nuit, Tête d'homme et femme, Auger dans le calme. Others, on the contrary, are less common, such as Beau comme une cathédrale gothique. Clipping photograph cuttings on the support of his drawings was not an uncommon practice for Miró. He was used to sticking them on canvases he would afterwards paint. They were used as motifs. Sometimes the final painting or sculpture can be directly related to the clip, which he used as inspiration. We can observe this relation especially on his works before the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s. We decided to trace back the photographs to reveal their origin in an attempt to understand how and why did Miró get these printed photographs of Sumerian masterpieces. Luckily, the archives at the Miró Foundation in Barcelona held a large paper photograph cutting in sepia from a magazine, showing the image of a new Sumerian terracotta figurine from Tello. Thanks to the help of the archivists at the Picasso Museum in Barcelona, we were able to identify the magazine from which the page had been cut. It appeared to be the French cultural magazine Arts et Loisirs from February 1966. To our luck, all the photographs but 2 belonged to the same magazine. Arts et Loisirs was published between 1966 and 1967. It was a French cultural magazine edited by the journalist André Parinot. In its short life, the magazine was able to publish articles by well-known writers and philosophers such as Georges Perret, Michel Foucault, and Claude Bonnefoy. Even the French Assyriologist Jean Bottero contributed with the text. Precisely his text was one of the 2 illustrated articles that caught Miró's attention. Both articles were dealing with the same topic, a large and stunning exhibition that had opened at the Molière Gallery at the Louvre Museum in Paris, lasting from January to March 1966. The exhibition was called Trésors du Musée de Bagdad, des origines à l'Islam. It was an international traveling exhibition of masterpieces from the Baghdad Museum, curated by André Parot, shown at least in Paris and Bordeaux in France and in Torino in Italy. The reason for this international exhibition, which would be impossible today for obvious reasons, was due to the closure of the old Baghdad Museum, while the new museum was still under construction. We know now that Miró was attracted to these Sumerian objects, but we can only speculate to the day of today about the nature of his interest. We may think they fitted his taste or conception of what art should be, or how it should represent the world. In fact, large hypnotic eyes and schematic figures had always fascinated him. Brigitte Pede already pointed out possible formal relations between the position of the arms and the gesture of the hands of a large Sumerian worshipper statue and some of the graffiti. It is in fact a common gesture in Miró's anthropomorphic representations. Additionally, we would add the hypothesis of a formal similarity between the bow that the warrior is handling in a fragment of a Sumerian relief and the moon in the nearby graffiti. The moon is a motif that constantly appears in Miró's work since his early paintings. Related to female figures, surrealistic Spanish artists often compared the shape of the moon to the horns of a bull, a transformation that Miró must have known well. However, this seems to be the first time where the moon is compared to a bow. Miró would have used a shape identified in a Sumerian vase to give a new meaning to his drawing. The bow, as a symbol of war or hunt, transubstantiated or transfigured into a crescent moon, changing its meaning since the moon has been interpreted as a symbol of love. Some of these sketches on the walls were used as drafts for future works. Historians have shown the relation between a graffiti showing a large head and a later bronze sculpture shown at Somboter. Next to the drawing, we find precisely the Yala figurine from the Baghdad Museum, next to the words sense cabellera ni forats, which in Catalan means without hair nor holes. It is accepted that this same graffiti served also as interpretation and inspiration for another work by Miró, the marble sculpture Femme et Chevalet, meaning woman with a tousled look, from 1968, shown at the gardens at the Maillet Foundation in Saint-Paul-de-Vence in France. We are speculating on the connection between those two large sculptures and the Sumerian figurine. However, some unknown facts about Miró's relation to Mesopotamia are not speculations. The Miró Succession Archives at Palma de Mallorca hold a postcard that Henri Matisse sent to Miró in August 7, 1934, representing a small copper bull from Tello, from the Louvre Museum in Paris. Again, the bull iconography, so present in a large number of paintings, drawings, and sculptures of so many Spanish avant-garde artists. We know Miró bought the first edition of Samuel Noah Kramer's History Begins in Sumer, published in 1957. Also, André Malraux sent him a dedicated volume of his books on the Imaginary Museum, including most of the Sumerian masterpieces he would later on hang on his walls. He also had a copy of André Parot's book on ASOR in a Spanish edition of 1961. Besides, he kept a fragment of the guide of an exhibition held at the Maillet Foundation from July to September in 1973, which was dedicated to André Malraux. The exhibition included some outstanding archaeological items, among them a well-known seated worshipper from Mary belonging to the National Museum of Damascus in Syria. This figurine was used to cover the guide of the exhibition, which Miró cut and hooked on one of the walls of his studio. Additionally, in one of his notebooks, he wrote down a series of volumes of the French magazine Cahiers d'Art that were devoted to Mesopotamian art in a list of publications he wanted to acquire. It seems that Miró's knowledge on the Mesopotamian art was deeper than expected. To our surprise, in comparison to the very few publications on Egyptian, Cycladic, Greek, or Far Eastern art on his personal library, those publications on Mesopotamian art outnumber the rest. We have been able to trace another use that Miró made of the Sumerian figurines shown at the Ars et Loisirs magazine. Kept in a large envelope which contained graphic material, it was used as a reference for a ballet. Miró was not the first modern artist to be involved in the design of theatrical scenography. Many other painters, such as Pablo Picasso from the early 20th century, were in charge of set and wardrobe of theater and ballet plays. Miró conceived a ballet called L'Oiseau in the early 30s, a work he would continuously retake during the rest of his life. He was initially in charge of the plot and the costume design. In a version of 1960s, which finally did not take place for economic reasons, the Sumerian statuette was supposed to be projected together with the other images of the envelope, today held at the Foundation in Barcelona, in a rapid manner on a screen, quote, in order to evoke the painter, his studio, his works, and universe, end quote. For Miró, great art was collective and anonymous. He believed that what he called primitive art, in which he would have included Sumerian art, was anonymous. Popular and collective art were anonymous as well. In order to find true art, il faut remonter jusqu'aux sources de l'expression pour retrouver le collectif. We would find these attributes in modern ballet as well. Quote, le ballet est le type même de l'art collectif, end quote. Ballet, primitive, popular, and anonymous art were all intimately associated for Miró. All images on the envelope for the ballet show traditional, folkloric, anonymous objects and spaces. They were not personal creations, but instead they followed traditional patterns, materials, and techniques that belonged to no one. Miró was fond of objects and buildings whose author had not been remembered because, for him, names of artists were not important at all. We can speculate that even if Miró knew that these terracotta figurines belonged to Sumerian culture, he chose to look at them as traditional figurines, in a similar way as he looked at the traditional Mediterranean or Balearic painted terracotta figurines called siurreis. Probably, it is precisely for this reason that no one mentioned before Brigitte Pede that the clips on his studio walls were Sumerian. The permanence of shapes and techniques fascinated Miró. Sumerian figurines were 1,000 years old, and yet they looked like modern traditional works he loved, bought, and collected in his studio. In both ancient and modern sculptures, the notion of author, of the personal creator, was abolished. Sumerian items were valuable for Miró, not because they were old, but because they were timeless, showing that great art was not ahead of time, but out of time, relevant in any period of time. Now, how do these experiences and reflections contribute to today's session? We were initially planning to talk about the conditions of exhibiting archaeological material related to the show From Ancient to Modern mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. However, what should have been initially an addendum case study for the exhibition in New York turned out to capture the attention of the Miro Foundation in Barcelona. They have understood that this revelation is most interesting for them and have agreed to start organizing a small exhibition on the matter, which would be held in 2017. So now our question is, what should we show in such an exhibition? Would it be ideal to undertake a similar selection of objects as in the case of the exhibition at the ISAW in New York, showing both modern works of art by Miró together with the original archaeological material which he used as inspiration? This would be completely out of the question, since most of these items belong to museums that are incapable, even if not unwilling, to lend their collections unknown, such as the National Museum of Baghdad or the National Museum of Damascus in Syria. But even if we would be able to bring them to the Miro Foundation in Barcelona, would it be necessary or even appropriate? Both exhibitions, at the ISAW and at the Miro Foundation, are not in fact exhibitions on ancient items or cultures, but instead they focus on the way these items and cultures were perceived and interpreted by a certain audience in a given period. They were not exhibitions on ancient culture, but on the way history of this ancient culture is built. So, does this focus turn the exhibition into an archaeological exhibition? Or are we exclusively dealing with modern art through the eyes of Miró? In fact, a contemporary art exhibition may include only archival material, since it is accepted that the process of creation of a work of art produces objects and documentation, sometimes equally as important as the final culminating work. If we would include an archaeological archival material, would we be talking about an archaeological exhibition? The question we are facing now can be answered only if we are able to know what did Miró in fact see. How he saw the Sumerian artifacts. Did he see them live in Paris or in St. Paul de Vence? Or did he only see them as photographs in publications? What precisely captures his attention, the object or the image of the object? We do not know whether he saw live Sumerian artifacts from the Baghdad Museum in 1966, nor whether he had seen Sumerian or Mesopotamian artifacts from the Louvre Museum in a previous journeys to Paris. The exhibition does not deal, in any case, with Sumerian art, but with Miró looking at Sumerian art. As we are dealing with images, we should work with images, showing what he saw, even if we are aware that what he saw is not what we shall see. The exhibition deals, in fact, with our vision to Miró's vision on Sumerian artifacts. We are exhibiting objects that were not created to be exhibited, and that were not always and not necessarily looked as man-made items. By the sole fact of deciding to exhibit them, we are bringing modern point of view on them. Museums have transformed all man-made artifacts into works of art, changing totally their meaning. This is not a problem, but a fact. Still, we can only judge them as works of art, and the sole fact that we judge them shows a modern relation to these items. In the short time since we started this research, a large number of questions have arisen us, most of which we are not yet able to answer, since this is an ongoing research, and we hope to be able to share these reflections with you on a next meeting or on a next exhibition. Thank you for your attention.